Yellow civil engines here, ready to ignite in a 3D drone, making transportation right. Visualizing dreams.
Welcome to video 2 of the Civil Engine tutorial series as part of BeyondCAD University. In this video, we're going to cover importing and texturing base models. And Civil Engine base models created in SketchUp and InfraWorks serve as foundational layers for high-quality photorealistic visualization. These preliminary designs are refined and detailed in Civil Engine with realistic textures, 3D assets, lighting, and interactive elements, transforming them into immersive visualizations that enhance project presentations and stakeholder engagement. As a note, we will not be covering base models outside of SketchUp and InfraWorks workflows as part of this video series, but there are a number of other workflows that do work, including Open Roads Designer, and we hope to produce content on those workflows in the future. Above all, we do recommend downloading and using the free trial of Civil Engine prior to purchasing so that you can make sure that Civil Engine works with the base models for your project files before you get far into this new visualization engine. Also, as a note, we're going to cover the basics of importing and texturing. If you want more in-depth and deep dives into how you can do more advanced base modeling, import, and texturing, I recommend the Civil Visualizing with Sam series. And also, I've linked a webpage on our website called Civil Engine Base Modeling Best Practices, and that's where you can learn the exact settings and other parameters that you need to set to make sure that you get the best experience when you export and import your base models. And then finally, the file types supported in Civil Engine are FBX and OBJ at this point. In the future, we may add other file types or other integrations like Datasmith, but for now, we've specifically chosen to focus on FBX and OBJ as they tend to give the best experience for importing and texturing base models. All right, let's get started. All right, our number one recommended platform for base models is SketchUp Pro. We understand that not everyone has access to or the experience to use SketchUp. We do offer consulting services where we can do base modeling for you, so reach out to us at the contact us page at beyondcad.com. But if you are able to get in a file into SketchUp, you probably will get the best results importing into Civil Engine. For now, we're going to show a very basic example. So let's say that we want to create a square, and this is 10 feet by 10 feet. One of the most important things you need to understand with your base model in SketchUp is that it should be close to or at the point of origin, which is 0, 0, 0, and is also here. So sometimes you may import objects from ORD or InfraWorks or Civil 3D. They may be way far away from the point of origin. You're gonna have a lot of trouble bringing them into Civil Engine if that's in the case. In the future, we do hope to get better global georeferencing features, but for now, getting your base model close to the point of origin is gonna give you the best results. All right, so we have our 10 by 10 and now we're gonna do 10 feet up. And so now we have a cube on all sides. When you have your base model, you need to make sure as much as possible that your faces are flipped the right way. So you can reverse faces, you can right click, and when it's reversed, you'll see that it's kind of a grayish blue texture. You want everything to be white if you're using the default texture as part of SketchUp. Sometimes you may not understand this because there are textures applied to your base model already, and you'll only notice that after you import into Civil Engine. If that's the case, you may have to fix all the flipped faces and re-import before moving forward any further in Civil Engine. All right, so let's just do some basic texturing here. All right, so we have our materials here. Let's just use different colors and try and use as much contrast as possible. All right, so we've got all of our faces with textures, and in your base model you do need to have textures applied because that's how we're going to apply the more realistic textures that are available in the material library in Civil Engine. Okay, so now we're ready to export. As a note, the drop down, I'm using two screens, so the drop down is showing up on the other screen, but I'm going to export 3D model, and now we can see here we have our choice, OBJ and so on. Again, we support OBJ and FBX, so we need to make sure that it is set to that. So we want to just do square and then open our options. You can test around with these again, and we recommend making sure these workflows work with your own data before importing. But if you're simply working in SketchUp, you'll probably have the best experience if you have export texture maps selected. And then we want to just leave units as centimeters, as long as that matches up in our units in Civil Engine. So let's do OK. And very quickly, we know that we have 6 faces, 6 materials. This is pretty basic. The more complex you get, obviously, we're going to get much higher numbers. All right, so now we're in Civil Engine. This is the Getting Started screen. And you can import base models after you're in the Getting Started screen, but you'll probably have the best experience if you do it from here. So we want to go to Import Base Model here, and then we want to find our file. You need to make sure it's set to OBJ, and then you'll see we have square here. You can see we can change the name, and we want to make sure that this is set to centimeters because that's what we exported it as. Most of the rest of these can be set as defaults, but again, you can do your own testing based on your own 3D base models. All right, so let's do Finish Import. And that happened very quickly because it was so small. If you have larger files, that may take longer to import. And again, because I was at the point of origin, 0, 0, 0, the camera was able to find the base model. If you have the base model far away from the point of origin, you're probably going to struggle as far as that goes. All right, so there's 2 ways to import in Civil Engine. One is as a base model, you can see here on the import panel, which we have here. The other is as an asset. Both of them support OBJ and FBX imports. The difference is when you import an asset, it behaves a little bit differently by design. So let's say that we want to do the square, and we're going to rename this and call it Square Asset. Leave the same settings, do Finish Import. And now it doesn't show up as a base model, but it is here in the panel. So now we can drag it around and we can place it in our scene just like any other asset from our library. This isn't how base model works. This is how imported assets work. So we've placed it here. We can move that around. And then the other key difference between the base model and the asset, when we're placing other assets or other nodes, like for example of a path, the base model is going to respect that. So let's find a tree. See how we can place the base model on the tree on the base model, but on the imported asset, it doesn't do that. So this is again by design, and that's because we want base models to be the base. We want that to be asphalt, concrete, soil, possibly other elements like striping. But then the imported assets, we want that to be used for things like light poles or park benches or specific assets for your project. And so just be mindful when you're importing stuff. Do you want to import it as a base model, or do you want to import it as an imported asset? Imported assets also show up here, and we can place a lot of them like this, whereas base models, they just show up that one time whenever you import them. Also, when you import a base model, it's going to show up in the hierarchy under base models. So we can see here all of those different textures. Whereas the asset, it's only going to show up if we place it in the 3D scene, like so. So if we delete all those, that still exists in our import panel, that square asset, but there's nothing in the hierarchy because the hierarchy only shows assets that have been placed in 3D space. Let's now texture. So to texture, again, we can open the hierarchy and we can find our base model, and then we can see the different surfaces. In the future, we do plan to have a paintbrush tool and a picker tool that will make this much more efficient. We don't have that at the time of the recording of this video, but for now, you do need to open the hierarchy, and then you can tab through and see which ones are highlighted to find the texture that you're trying to find. So if we want to do this yellow side, you'll see here the details panel that we mentioned in the first video. That's going to show details depending on what's currently selected. For in this one, let's say that we want to apply one of the textures from our texture library. Say that we want to apply a asphalt texture. So what it's doing is it's taking the tint that was brought over from the base model import, and it's applying that on top of there. So we can remove that by clicking here and then going to white, and now that's the default texture. But you can tint anything you want by moving these sliders or moving this around. One of the common cases is maybe you want green asphalt for part of a bike lane, or maybe you want colored brick pavers. So any texture can be tinted through this tinting system. You can also import your own image file by going to Import New. And let's say that we wanted to import this, for example. It took a minute, but it did import it. And now you can see those are very small. And we can also make a few adjustments to there. So right now we want to make it 0.01, and now we can adjust that scale. We can also adjust the rotation. There are a few more parameters for adjustment for imported textures versus the material library as part of Civil Engine, but we do plan to add more features in the future as part of this overall system. All right, so let's just make all of these faces, let's assign them to materials in the asset library. So let's just do various asphalt colors and then just make sure that they are white. All right, so now we've applied different asphalt textures to each of the faces of our cube. And now we can review that by rotating around. And obviously we could go back through and make adjustments to those as necessary. This is going to be a very common workflow. You import the base model first, and then you assign textures from the material library within Civil Engine to give it that realistic look before you do anything else in Civil Engine. All right, so let's say that we have multiple pieces that we want to import as part of our base model. Maybe we want to import a bridge separately because we're doing a construction phasing sequence. So what we're going to do here is we're going to make a few other cubes. And then let's change the texturing of these so that we can differentiate them once we import them in. So in this scenario, what you want to do, because these will export and import relative to each other, relative to the origin point. So if we want to import this piece separately, then we're going to go to File, Export 3D Model, and let's do square red. And then this is important. We want to do Export Only Current Selection. Everything else we want to keep the same. And then let's do the same for green. All right, so now let's go back into Civil Engine, and we want to go to Import, Base Models, Import New, make sure we're selecting OBJ, and then we want to select Square Green, leave the settings as is, finish import, and then we got to go to OBJ again, Square Red, finish import. So hopefully you can see that these came in relative to the way they were in our base model in SketchUp. So if you are exporting multiple pieces, and this can be very useful again for a scenario like a bridge or buildings or maybe terrain, you can export them all out as part of the same base model, and they will come in the same place in your model in Civil Engine relative to each other, which is very important. If you don't do that, what you need to do is you need to select that base model in the hierarchy, and then you need to manually move it. And in this example, it's going pretty quickly because these are small, but this can be very tedious for large models or large terrain. And so it's best if you can get them to export correctly relative to each other as part of the base model, rather than moving them using either the transform gizmo here, or sometimes you may even have to slide these spin bars over here in the details panel to get it positioned correctly, because you're going to want to make sure that everything is lined up globally where it needs to be, especially until we get better global georeferencing features as part of future versions of Civil Engine. All right, so we're back to just our original square, and we call these, sometimes we'll refer to them as texture faces, but we also refer to them as submesh components. So these can be handled separately in the hierarchy from just like any other asset in other areas of the hierarchy. So if we wanted to turn off one of these faces, and this is actually pretty common. Sometimes you'll have a base model and something will come in that you don't want to be there. You can delete it, but best practice is probably just to turn off that face so that you can reference it by turning it back on again if you need to. You can also, as I just showed, right-click and organize these submesh components into their own folders for better organization. And then you can also assign these their own names. So face 1, face 2, and so on. And this can be extremely helpful when you're bringing in a very complex base model, because sometimes you may bring in a base model with submesh components that have really weird names. So if you realize, okay, this surface is the grass, then you name it grass. This surface is the water. This surface is the concrete. This surface is the new asphalt. You give them the names here. That way, the next time you open up the submesh components in your base model hierarchy, then you're going to quickly be able to reference those and find those. This becomes very important, especially with design files from ORD or from InfraWorks. Some of them are going to have hundreds of submesh components, and so the quicker that you can name them, the more efficiency you're going to have in assigning and referencing back those various submesh components. All right, let's now move to a more complex base model importing and texturing example. What we have here is a diverging diamond base model. This is the same base model that's part of the example project donated to us by our friends over at Ardura. And this was built in OpenRoads Designer, and then there's an export to SketchUp function from ORD, and that's how we got this to be in this state. We've also heard early reports from testers that you can go directly from ORD as a FBX or OBJ, and we do hope to get more information on our website and as part of BeyondCAD University to give more documentation on the best practices for those. For now though, if you're able to get it into SketchUp, it's going to look something like this. From here, you can do further review and cleanup. When we first got this model, there were a few missing faces, and we were able to clean those up here in SketchUp. Again, I'm a SketchUp user, and so I know how to clean those up. If you are not, you can reach out to someone that is, or you can reach out to our team over at BeyondCAD Studio, and we can help you out with this. But essentially, we can go and use the picker tool to make sure that we have that right texture, and then assign and clean up faces like that. So once we're happy with this, then we can go to File, Export, 3D Model, and follow the same steps as we did before, just with a more complex model. So we're going to do this Florida DDI, also use an OBJ. For our options, we want to leave all these settings the same, and then leave it at centimeters, and then press OK. Now we're going to press Export, and you'll see this window pop up saying Writing Entities. If this is a large file, this process may take several minutes. Fortunately, this one only took a few seconds. We have 82,000 faces, 68 materials, 28 textures, and so on. We can press OK, and now let's go back into Civil Engine. All right, so we're back in Civil Engine, and again, we can start our project by going to Import Base Model, using the drop-down to select OBJ, select Florida DDI. We want to make sure the original units are set to centimeters, and we can leave the other defaults as is for now. It's also important to just review these notes up here. You want to, for best performance, you're going to want to just follow these notes. Anything bigger than 500 megabytes might not work. Those objects with numerous large embedded aerial textures, texture resolutions, more than 8,000 pixels on any side. Again, positioning, anything that's placed far away from the origin point. You need to kind of follow these for best practices of getting your base model into Civil Engine. Once you're ready, you can press Finish Import. And now you can see here, this is what our base model looks like in Civil Engine. You'll note we have this flickering blue thing, and this was actually something happening in SketchUp. And we could remove that in SketchUp, but we could also go ahead and just turn off that here in Civil Engine. So if I go to my hierarchy and I go to base models, we just have that one base model. And then we can go through here and we can find it by tabbing through until we find that highlighted segment. All right, so we found it down here at the bottom. Now we can turn that off, and now it's not going to show up. Can turn back the other face, and now we don't have that flickering issue anymore. All right, so you can tell that this isn't looking anything like our example project because it's trying to extrapolate the faces that are brought over from SketchUp, but we don't want to do that. We want to use the high quality materials that we have in our own material library. And so we do that again by going through one by one and assigning materials through the details panel over here on the left. So I'm not going to go through every one of these, but for the main surfaces, you can see here this is a bridge. Bridges are most often concrete, so we want to click the brush tool, do a drop down, and find a concrete texture, and then we can tint it or make it darker, whatever we feel like we need to do to give it the most realistic texture. And as a note, with large files, this tinting process can be time consuming, so again, we appreciate your patience as we continue to improve this process. All right, so now this is the substructure components. Again, probably concrete, but maybe a different style. So we have a number of different concrete styles that we can choose from. This one tends to be, I think, pretty dark. So maybe we can go with something like that. All right, so now we have the freeway surface. This would be asphalt. We have a number of asphalt types, and sometimes you can use something fresh if you want it to look really black, but for the most part, this default light texture tends to be a very realistic one and will work well in most scenarios. And this is, I think, kind of the fan favorite brought over from Beyond Typicals. And we have different versions of it. We have a dark, a light, and a green, but it's all the same underlying texture. And just as a reminder, as we go through and texture these, we can also rename them over here on the right, because you can see the names that currently exist, they're just, they're not very clear, and so we just want to call this bridge top, or bridge surface. All right, so this one you can see here, this is a big coverage area, so very important to find this one. This is, we'll call this the grassy area. It's already kind of listing that right now. And then we want to make sure that that has one of our grass textures as part of it. And then again, this can be a little buggy, but you just want to make sure that that is set to full white, which is all F's across. That's when you know that you have the original material library texture. All right, and then this is also another important part, which is kind of our DDI asphalt. And we can go through here. Let's say that we want to use that same asphalt texture, but we want to do the dark version and make sure that it's not darker than it needs to be. All right, so now you can see how, without too much effort, we can quickly assign textures to all the subsurface components, also assign them names as necessary as part of this process to build out our model. I'm going to jump over to this example project to show what it will look like once they're all assigned. All right, so this is that example project using that same base model that I was showing in SketchUp. And we can turn off all of the placed assets just to give a reference of how that base model will look. We can also do the same with all of our paths, which include our traffic, striping cleanup, trees, and other elements. And so now we can see this is how the base model looks fully textured, as opposed to this is how the base model looked in SketchUp. And so the goal with Civil Engine is you need a base model, you need to export it from wherever the 3D modeling software is that you're using, and then you need to bring it into Civil Engine where you apply our photorealistic materials from our material library, and then you place assets using the path system, the area system, our 3D asset library, and so on. That is Civil Engine in a nutshell, and that's why base modeling is so essential to get right, because if you can't get your base model to import correctly, then you're not going to get very far as part of this process. Again, there's a series on our YouTube channel and Beyond CAD University called Civil Visualizing with Sam, where I walk through this project and other projects in detail, where you can go through that process and you can see how in just a few hours you can go from base model to fully visualized. And a lot of these were done before we had some of these tools like area brush tools. And so yeah, if I were to do this again, it might even be faster. But for the most part, this is kind of the best practices for the export from SketchUp and import into Civil Engine. So while the goal of this video series is to focus on best practices of Civil Engine and not to be a comprehensive design and base modeling series, I do want to cover some basic troubleshooting to make sure that you can have the best success getting your base model into Civil Engine. So we have this model here that is from the SketchUp warehouse, and it may look fine right now, but again, we want to, these trees aren't good enough. We want to utilize the photorealistic trees in Civil Engine. We want to add traffic. We want to do all these things. And so we want to get it out of here in SketchUp and into Civil Engine. So if we just go ahead and export it as is, I kind of want to show why this is going to cause some problems. So let's just leave it as the default name, which is the name as part of the SketchUp warehouse. Let's leave the options the same as they were before and press export. All right, so the first thing you'll notice is that export took considerably longer. There's just a lot of polygons. This one had over 1 million faces, 1.38 million faces. Part of that is there's just so many of these components that have so much detail, and a lot of times that's not necessary. A lot of times these can be replaced in Civil Engine, and for example, all these tree faces, these are completely unnecessary. So best practice would probably be to go ahead and delete all those before you export and brought into Civil Engine. And we can show how this looks when we import into Civil Engine. For the most part, your base model should include asphalt, concrete, soil, which is your cuts and fills. Sometimes it's going to include other elements like striping or light poles, traffic signals, and so on. But that's kind of the gray area where some of that can be done in Civil Engine sometime, and some of it can be done in the base model. All right, so let's go to import base model. And if we go to OBJ, we can find our file. And let's say that we forgot to change original units because again, we export it as centimeters. Let's leave it as meters here and just see what happens. Again, the first thing we'll notice that this is going to take much longer to import into Civil Engine. And there's a pretty good link between how long something takes to export from SketchUp and how long it's going to take to import into Civil Engine, because it's got to bring in all of those million plus polygons into this 3D application. All right, so that took 2 or 3 minutes to import into Civil Engine, and you'll notice here that there's nothing, and you may experience this. The reason that this is happening is because if you go back to our SketchUp model, you may have noticed that we were not at the origin. And so when we're importing, what we're seeing in Civil Engine is something close to the origin, and our model's way off in the distance. So that's our first problem, is we're gonna have to go out and we're gonna have to find it. So we can zoom out using our scroll wheel, we can rotate, and with enough patience, we might be able to find this model. All right, so we just can't even find it. So in this scenario, we're gonna probably have to re-export and re-import at the point of origin. So we could go to our getting started screen. In this example, let's just delete it and then go re-export and re-import. We can also delete here from our panel just so that it doesn't add any extra data than is necessary. So let's go back to SketchUp and let's select our entire base model and then use the move tool to move it closer to our point of origin. All right, so now let's go to export again. Same settings as before. All right, so again, it took several minutes, same number of faces, but at least now we exported at the origin. Back in Civil Engine, without restarting a new session and going from the getting started screen, let's go to import new, go to OBJ, and then find the second version of this. Let's leave the settings as is and finish import. All right, so that took a little over 2 minutes again, but the good news is now we can at least see our base model. So if we move up, then we can see it. The problem is this thing is huge because we chose the wrong import settings. So a quick way where you can test that, other than just seeing that it's huge, is you could just always just place a traffic path, and you can see here where that path is supposed to be roughly 10 feet wide-ish, and how small it is here. So our base model is super small. So we could re-export and re-import, or we could re-import with the correct settings, or we can select the base model, and then we can go to scaling, and my best guess is this is centimeters to meters, so 0.01. That's going to give us the correct scale. I still have my camera sensitivity turned up, which is making things move around quickly. but we can delete that path that we placed in the sky. And let's try another one just to see if we're in the right ballpark. All right, so now we're in the right ballpark. But now we have more problems. You can see here that a lot of our faces aren't showing up the way that we would want them to. And in a lot of these cases, they're maybe white when they should be green. In some cases, they're just completely not showing up at all. You can see if you go underneath. And so again, this is due to a lower quality base model. And hopefully you won't have to deal with this too much. But if you do, you can carefully clean this up in your base model in SketchUp. Also, we noticed these trees. We don't want them to show up here. So we could delete them in SketchUp, or we could go through and find them here in the submesh components and just delete them or turn them off here. All right, so it took a few tabs, but we found it. And so now we can go here and just turn those guys off. So at least we can do that here. But as far as the flipped faces, that's something we're gonna have to go back into SketchUp and fix. I'm not gonna do the whole thing here. This would be very tedious and time consuming, but I will kind of show the best practices of how to do that. So sometimes the only way to do this is just to flip back and forth, or to have one of these open in one screen and one of them open in the other, and then just fix these faces one by one. So sometimes you can see what's going on. You may have to double click to get deeper into the hierarchy, into these various components. And so it seems here that a lot of these faces might be flipped. So we can right click and reverse face. And so now if we texture these faces appropriately, then they're gonna come in the way that they need to over here in Civil Engine. One thing that can also be helpful is sometimes you'll import an object and it will look like it's transparent. That may just be because the textures from SketchUp probably aren't double-sided, but the materials in the texture library in Civil Engine, they are double-sided, and so sometimes that will be a simple fix, is just to simply go through and find it and assign it a texture from our library. And by doing so, you will be able to just quickly fix those issues. So in this example, we can test it by clicking our paintbrush tool. This can be slow on these large files, and then going through and finding a texture. So that didn't fix it because those faces just simply aren't importing. So we got to go through and fix those faces one by one in SketchUp. So hopefully we won't have to go through this process, but I did want to point out that there are some troubleshooting, there are some issues that may come up, and these are kind of the best ways to do it. Again, you can reach out to us at our Contact Us page to ask for a quote on us helping you with your base model through Beyond CAD Studio. All right, now I want to cover best practices for exporting and importing base models from InfraWorks into Civil Engine. In general, I don't prefer the look of the 3D modeling generated in InfraWorks for visualization purposes. I think there are some uses for it in general for planning and so forth. But InfraWorks can be useful in other scenarios like collecting terrain, or we've seen a lot of our customers use it for Civil 3D to InfraWorks, and then from there to Civil Engine or other 3D visualization engines. And that's where they can add the more realistic trees, traffic, cameras, and so forth. So I do want to cover this because it is going to come up for a lot of our customers. The thing that you need to understand about InfraWorks is that there are obviously two formats you can import into Civil Engine, FBX and OBJ, but the FBX files don't work from InfraWorks, and the OBJ files need some work to be done. So I'll show how that's done. We're not going to worry about FBX. They come in, it's just the aerials are all flipped, and so until we fix that, you need to focus on OBJ. But you want to go to Present Share, click this Share dropdown, and then go to Export 3D Model. And then right here it says Define Interactivity. We could use entire model, or we could do a bounding box. If you use entire model, then it's going to take a long time. And for this example, I just want to keep it short, so I'm going to use a bounding box. And basically, it's going to allow me to just select which area I want to choose and which area I want to export. Now we can see here it says single file. This says FBX, so we want to change that. Go to downloads, go to OBJ, and then here you can export as multiple files or a single file. And so if there are multiple files, like maybe you want the buildings to come in separately, maybe you have trees or bridges or other elements, you can do it that way. For this example, we're just going to keep it as a single file. And then the rest of these, you can just leave them checked for now, and we want to export. All right, so that didn't take too long. So now we need to open Civil Engine, and let's go to Import Base Model. Switch to OBJ, and it's this IM export right here. Let's switch this to centimeters and do Finish Import. All right, you can see here, it came in and it's much too small. And so that should have been meters. So let's re-import. Let's go to OBJ, IM export, leave it at meters, and then we're going to need to do a base rotation. Let's do X, finish import. Now you can see it came in correctly, although it came up high in the sky. If it did this, we could build everything on top of it, but sometimes you just want to make sure it's lower, just so the clouds don't get in the way. And so if I put that as 0, it made it even higher. So let's just go like -3,000. All right, so everything looks and feels like it's the right scale, but again, a quick check on that is just go to place a traffic path and everything looks fine there. All right, so things are looking pretty much the way we would expect from InfraWorks. The problem is the aerials are too dark. And so what we need to do is we need to brighten them up. Again, this is a known issue, something we hope to have more features and tools for in the future. But for now, you can go to base models to do the drop down, and we can go through and find out which aerials those are, so that we can make sure that we fix them and reassign them. All right, so there are, looks like maybe 2 aerials, but this is just the one that's most important, material 36. Let's just rename that aerial so that we can remember it. And then what we need to do is go to our Windows folder structure and find that aerial image. So there should be a folder that came along with your export called textures. And you just need to go through and find which textures those are. It's going to have all the building faces and other things in here, but the ones we're most interested in are these aerials. So we need to open these up in a photo editing tool, and then we just need to go and make sure that we brighten these up. There are a number of ways you can do this. This is just the default Photos app. I did find this tool called PhotoBat where you can do a bunch at the same time. If you have a lot of them, I recommend this. I know this is tedious. It's something we do hope to work on in the future. But for now, we can just do this simply by editing this in the default photo editing in Windows. All right, save. Let's just save that as is, and then go find the other one. All right, so we're back in Civil Engine, and to get those textures applied again, what we need to do is we need to find them, and then you go to Import New. Let's get a better look at this one to make sure we're looking at the right one. There's a big parking lot over here, so change to JPEG. Let's go View, Extra Large Icons, and let's see if it's this one. It was not that one, so let's do the other one. All right, so now we're working with a brighter image. The image quality is not great on this, so hopefully you're working with better aerials in your own base model. But you need to go through and do that for all of the different aerials. And so this one only had one because it's a small one, but we have worked on some that have many more. And you just have to go through one by one, make sure that that image is brightened up, and then re-import it. And the same holds true if you edit anything else about your aerials. Sometimes we will go through and edit aerials to like remove vehicles or trees to get a really good kind of faux base model. And if you do that in Photoshop and you want to re-import it, then you use the same process. You just find it here in the submesh components in the hierarchy, go to import new, find that aerial, and then re-import it. All right, and then everything else in importing and texturing for InfraWorks holds true as it did for SketchUp. You just need to tap through and find the surfaces. A lot of this stuff you may not even want because the buildings don't come in great shape. We could have removed them by exporting as separate files in InfraWorks, but if you want, you can just turn those off one by one here in the submesh components. You can see here now we're starting to get some of these other materials. So maybe we want to make this one of the concrete textures. This is one of the asphalt textures. And so over time you can get everything textured. All right, I wanted to open up this example project to demonstrate the quality and the results that you can get from InfraWorks. This is not one of the example projects included in when you download Civil Engine, but if you click on more example projects, you'll find it. It's called Lord's Pass, and this was donated to us by our friends over at VHB. And you can see how this is another, it's an InfraWorks based model, just like what we were working with SketchUp, but they have really good quality because they did the modeling in Civil 3D, and then they brought it over, I believe, as surfaces or draped surfaces or something in InfraWorks, and then this is the level of quality that you can get, especially once we get all the textures applied, we get our traffic in, pedestrians, and so on. This is a work in progress. We don't have all the intersection controllers set up the way that we need to, but with time you can see how you can go from a base model in InfraWorks to something much more realistic than what you would typically get out of InfraWorks. So I just want to use that as a reference for those that may be interested in testing the InfraWorks to Civil Engine workflow, and noting that you can get some really good quality, especially if you work hard to get some good modeling and then import that into Civil Engine and then clean up from there. I didn't go through and lighten up the darkened aerials here, so you can see if they're as is, they're not terrible, but everything is just a little bit darker for some reason when you import as an OBJ from InfraWorks, and going through that process of finding those in the submesh component and then brightening them up in image editing, that will give you better results. As a warning, some of these big models, they're just a lot of submesh components, a lot of materials in InfraWorks, and so just be mindful that it might be a little bit more tedious to go through this workflow, which is why we recommend SketchUp whenever possible for base models. All right, finally, I just want to go through a very common scenario that is a concern of a lot of users and potential users of Civil Engine, and that is what happens if my design changes? What happens if my base model changes? Do I have to start from scratch? And fortunately, the answer is no. And I want to show how that process works. So we've got this road here in SketchUp as our base model, very basic example, but hopefully you can extrapolate to more complex scenarios. So let's go to File, Export, and let's just do a road section. Shout out to our other product, Beyond Typicals, where you can do road sections like this very easily. Let's say we're doing something like this in Civil Engine. Let's leave the settings as is and export. So very quick, only 812 faces, and let's open Civil Engine. All right, so we're here at the Getting Started screen. Let's go to Import Base Model, find our file, switch to OBJ, and make sure that this is set to centimeters. And now you can see here, we've got our base model. So let's very quickly set up our scene by assigning textures, hierarchy, base model, drop down, submesh components. Let's make this a texture. Let's make this a grass. Let's make this a concrete. And let's make this a different type of concrete. All right, so we've got our nice road here. You can see we have some issues with missing faces, flipped faces, and we can look into fixing that. But for the most part, things are looking fine. So let's add our traffic. Let's add some trees. And let's add some light poles. So we can search here. All right, so very quickly, we've got our beautiful visualization going on here in Civil Engine, but oh no, our project manager just came to us and said, hey, we're going to widen that median and it's now going to be like 7 feet wide. So what are we going to do? So what we're going to do is go back to our base model and let's make that change. So to make that change, again, the goal of this is not to give a full detail of how to do modeling in SketchUp, but essentially we're going to just quickly pull this out. Let's do this by 5 feet. And then again, those faces were flipped over here. So while we're at it, let's see if we can right click, reverse faces. And then we just want to make sure our textures are appropriate. And actually while we're at it, let's make this entire median concrete as part of this design change, and then fix these flipped faces here. All right, there's some funkiness going on. For the most part, I think you get the point. All right, so everything else we need to leave as is. Export, exact same settings as before. Same export options as before. Export. All right, so now we're back in Civil Engine and we want to re-import this. We currently don't have a way to refresh it, and so what you need to do currently is we can just shut that off. So you can see this is what it looks like when it shuts off. Then we need to go to Base Models, Import New, switch to OBJ, Road Section Revised, leave everything else the same, finish import. So now you can see all we have to do is adjust the assets and then retexture things. And also that flipped face issue, we were able to fix it, which is nice. All right, and if the traffic's ever distracting, you can just shut it off down here at the bottom right and turn off our path visualizers. Okay, so let's get these assets adjusted. And then we need to make sure and retexture everything. So we could turn off, we could delete this first road section, or we can leave it as reference. Like maybe we want to remember which textures we used. We can just leave it there and just leave it off. That's probably the best practice. All right, so let's go through and just reapply the textures. Okay, and then what I would do if I were actually doing this is I would combine these trees into their own folder, name that trees, the tree lights in their own folder, name that lights, lock these guys so those selector icons don't keep popping up, and then turn our traffic back on. Now you can see our traffic's off. We need to get that adjusted as well, which is easy enough. Just go to paths, adjust those nodes. We could, if it's easier, you can just delete these and start from scratch. Either way shouldn't take more than a few minutes depending on the size of your project. And there we go. Now we made adjustments as necessary for the revised base model, the revised design. And so hopefully that's some level of comfort that if your design changes, you don't have to change everything. You just have to retexture your base model after you import it and then adjust your assets. All right, so that wraps up import and texturing as part of this Civil Engine tutorial series as part of Beyond CAD University. My name is Sam Lytle. I'm the lead creator on this project. I'm super excited to have you along with me. I'm excited in the next video to show you all that we can do with assets.